Activists around the country are calling for new ways to make sure the investment of local tax money for pensions reflects community values. That's why they're calling for changes in how the money's invested and more disclosure. Locally, the City Council has scheduled a hearing on pension investments that would be convened by the Boston Ujima Project, the Center for Economic Democracy, and the Corrections Accountability Project. To explain the idea, our community organizer and human rights advocate Hillary Nikyema and a consultant with Sustainserv, Milosavljevic. Thank you both for being with us. I want to start with Hillary because here in Boston we've heard about the Ujima Project. I thought of this as local people in the neighborhoods, local entrepreneurs supporting each other. How do you get from that to what's going on with city pensions?
Well, I think that the Ujima Project, as you mentioned, does a really great job of advocating for locally owned businesses that are owned by people of color. And the Corrections Accountability Project and Ujima have been convening a collective of people from different divestment campaigns, whether it be fossil fuels or the peace movement, to come together to really focus in on this issue as it pertains to Boston.
If I'm a Boston taxpayer and I'm concerned about how pension money is invested, why should I be concerned?
So you should be concerned because our city's investments should accurately reflect the values that we state to hold. So an example of that is Boston is a sanctuary city. However, we invest heavily in private prison companies that do contract with ICE. So that's an obvious contradiction in our investments and values. Another instance is Boston is a human rights city, but we invest heavily in military contractors that benefit from war and conflict. So it very much is a values question and what value we want to bring to our communities and how.
Well, private company run prisons, they make profits from that, but what about their influence on policy? Is there much to be concerned about with that?
Absolutely, but the divestment campaign is a very tactful approach to raising public awareness of the corporate influence on our representatives and also the power that local community members have to, facilitate this change.
Hillary, you've also been looking at the factor here of prisons. What are you concerned about?
Well, I think in terms of Boston, my concern, and I know the concern of the collective of people who are coming together to raise awareness about Boston's pension, is that Boston has intentionally excluded private prisons from the city, right? Massachusetts doesn't have private prisons, and yet Boston does have investments outside of Massachusetts that are in relation to private prisons. So our economic growth as a city comes off the backs of exploiting people.
We've also heard a lot about investments in fossil fuel industries and how that contributes to problems with climate change. Is that a big part of city pensions, you think?
Absolutely. Fossil fuels have historically been a large investment that cities are making, and it also has to do with what you touched on earlier with corporate interests influencing representatives both on the federal and local level. So we need to really address that conflict of interest.
In Hillary, of course, what you're also trying to do is get something done, starting with the City Council in Boston. Explain the strategy a little bit.
Yeah, I think the overall strategy is that people in Boston want to be involved in the process of accountability, of democracy and transparency. We want to know where our city's funds are going, and we want to be able to participate and have a voice in that.
This is BNN News, and we're talking about ideas for socially responsible pension investments with Hillary Nikyema and Milosavljevic. Anna, what about getting information on where the city invests its pension money? I mean, how much do we know, at least the general public?
Sure. So the city has actually released what it invests in, and we know currently that it has about $5 billion overall in its pension, which are invested in stocks and other companies. And in cash reserves, it has $1.5 billion. So those are very large sums of money that, first of all, the cash can be easily moved. And second of all, the pension needs to be addressed because it is such a large amount of money.
Hillary, of course, the other reason we have pension money is that when people retire, they depend on this money. They want to make sure there's a profitable return. So how do you make sure that's the case if you're trying to be socially responsible at the same time?
I think reinvesting that money in our communities ultimately gets the best investment back for pension holders. Essentially, investing in education, in locally owned businesses and co-ops help, get a greater return for individual value, but also for community value as well.
Has this been done already some places around the country?
Absolutely. Actually, in Portland, Oregon, the pension has divested from all corporations, period. And we have other cities such as Philadelphia and New York City divesting from private prisons or fossil fuel companies. So it's very possible.
The other thing, Hillary, is when one city does this, my first reaction is this does not change the world, it doesn't change policy that much, but when you add it up, what do you think? Is there much of an effect here as far as changing the world, changing values even?
Absolutely. Divestment is only a tool, right? And divestment is a really great tool and a really great strategy for creating global change. And it happens on a local level. And we're hoping that in terms of this divestment movement, that it can create momentum to sort of dismantle the reputation of these companies that are exploiting human beings, so that other cities will follow and soon other states will follow as well. It's important to note that in 1984, even though Boston was going through a racially divisive time, we were able to pass legislation that prohibited Boston companies from investing in companies that were contributing to the apartheid in South Africa. And that divestment was maybe, the most effective strategy in apartheid South Africa.
Anna, what about the value of just putting a focus on some of these things and getting people to talk about them, whether it's fossil fuels, prisons for profit? Is there some value in that at least?
There's definitely a value, and that's part of the divestment strategy, is increasing public awareness of these issues. So those contribute to mass consciousness and then ultimately mass movements against companies that are exploiting other people.
Hillary, what about the importance of this money to people in the community? Because you think if somebody's running a business, if they're successful, they will have investors knocking at the door. But what about the need for more investment in this city here? I mean, people who cannot get the investment.
Yes, so our communities in Boston are currently underfunded, especially communities of color, and Boston being a minority-majority city and over 50% of our population being people of color and a quarter of those people being immigrants, it is important that people in Boston have the opportunity to participate in locally owned businesses and thriving economically in their community.
And Anna, finally, we should mention a little bit about the event that's happening tomorrow, I think, with the City Council.
Yes, so tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Boston City Hall, the City Council is convening a hearing on the pension investments in socially irresponsible companies. So it's not topic specific, and we have over 15 organizations testifying on different issues related to peace, prisons, climate. So members of the community should feel welcome to attend.
And finally, Hillary, any website people should check out for information about this campaign?
Yes, we actually do have a hashtag that's trending, which is Divest Boston, and we are encouraging people to come out and live stream and live tweet, and it should be great. I should also mention that there will be 3 separate panels, one that's specifically focused on divestment, one that's focused on reinvestment, and one that's focused on the SRI community, which is socially responsible investments.
Thank you both very much, Hillary Nikyema and Anna Milosavljevic.
Thank you.
Thank you.